Mary MacKillop, a reflection. A very happy celebration for Mary MacKillop's feast day. To quote a phrase, we are living in a challenging time, as Mary did. Hers was a challenging time for individuals, for the country we call Australia, and for institutions such as churches and the emerging political and economic structures. Those who did not belong to the Church of England found social acceptance difficult as well. Mary MacKillop was one of the new generations of Australians who were born locally. Her parents migrated from Scotland. This immediately set her outside the mainstream of the Catholic Church, which was basically Irish. Julian, the co-founder of the Sisters of St. Joseph, was English, and this also placed him outside the Catholic Irish mainstream. In today's terms, we could say both Mary MacKillop and Julian Tennyson Woods were marginalised people because of their nationality, their poverty and their religion. Daniel Lyon, in his book Mary MacKillop Made in Australia, reminds us that Mary lived her life at two levels. The first level was the level of her outer journey. Her geography was her biology and vice versa. Australia was in her bones and was a country she loved, though she was aware of its virtues and its flaws, its justices and injustices, as we are today. Black Lives Matter is a cause she would respond to deeply, given Julian and Mary's love of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. Their love of Aboriginal people was traditionally known to the Sisters of St. Joseph, and was one of the reasons the sisters went to work in the Kimberley region in northern Australia in the middle 20th century. The second level and the most important level at which Mary lived her life was her inner journey. This inner journey determined the outer one in many ways. The inner journey led her through a path of suffering and love to a deep intimacy with God, who is love. Mary became transformed on this journey. Her transformation took place in tandem with her efforts to bring about the kingdom of love, justice and peace, the kingdom of God in the here and now. This is our journey too. It does not matter how small or how large is our lived circle. Where we are now is where we are challenged to bring the kingdom to life. In the midst of death, we are called to life. Mary died in 1909. Since that time, we have endured 2 world wars, nuclear bombings, a depression, a major influenza plague, a Cold War, nuclear tests in Australian and American deserts and elsewhere. As Australians, we have taken part in wars in Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, and in so many small wars we can't count them. The world lost its innocence in so many ways with the knowledge of the German concentration camps and the Jewish Holocaust, plus the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago. Now we have a global pandemic threatening life at all levels. Mary knew none of these things. She lived where she was alert to her city and what was happening there, though. That is our call today. To be where we are fully. Mary still exemplifies that truth to us strongly. So what then has Mary MacKillop, our first Australian saint and our patron saint, say to us today? There are many ways of answering that question, but on reflection, 4 come to my mind that I think are helpful for us in the situation in which we find ourselves. The first quality we call to mind is her awareness and perception. The second is her trust in God. The third is her self-love and self-giving. And the fourth, her commitment to all living things and to a life lived deeply out of love. The cross is integral to all these 4 things. So the first aspect of Mary's life we remember today is her awareness. She and Julian saw what everyone else saw in Penola and Adelaide, the hungry, disaffected poor, and reached out to them in a way that gave hope. They fed them, yes, but when they offered these same poor people an education, it gave them a tool which enabled them to change their life situation. Remember the old saying, if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day, but if you teach them to fish, they can eat for a lifetime. Being able to read, write, do arithmetic, study their faith, were all stepping stones to freedom at all levels of life. The boys and girls, rich and poor, were treated the same in the Josephite classroom. Mary worked on this micro level. She did not attempt to change the world, only the lives of those she saw needed help. It was a case of bloom where you were planted. Be aware, however, that the good we do in that small world will ripple out much further than we would believe possible. On Sunday the 2nd of August, we remembered the homeless. The TV programme Songs of Praise introduced a 13-year-old girl who started a movement in her parish for the homeless. When she was 11, she was moved by the people she saw sleeping in the street and went to them to find out what they needed. The result was she found helpers and created bags of hope. Her bags contained what the people she talked to said they needed to survive: blankets, beanies, gloves, water, sanitizer. They did not want to be perceived as dirty. It was a simple idea that no one else had thought of. The action was so much in the spirit of Mary MacKillop. Mary acted to relieve whatever suffering was around her because she noticed people's pain. In Mary's words, never see a need without being aware of how we can remedy it. Her own vocation began with the call at Penola. I heard the pastor from the altar speak of the neglected state of the children of the parish, and I had to go and offer myself to aid him, as far as the nature of my other duties would permit. There are always failures, obstacles, regressions when God's work is being done. Change is never easy, and there is always resistance, often in unexpected ways. Calvary is never far away, but always a prelude to resurrection. The excommunication and tribunal both saw Mary pushed away from the work she loved, ironically by people she loved, the bishops, priests, and even some of her own sisters. The struggle for Mary and her sisters was to keep a balance between respect for the clergy and respect for the poor who were vulnerable and, as a result, powerless. In spite of historical changes, we still struggle in a similar way. Mary was aware of what was happening, of the social and religious forces that tried to sustain the status quo, but she was resilient and kept going. She invites us to do the same. One of the reasons she was able to practice such awareness was her sensitivity. This was both gift and cross. Her sensitivity enabled her to see the suffering other and called her to action, but also led her to tears many times. The second element in Mary's life which speaks to us is trust. We are invited to keep trusting God and each other. Trust sometimes requires a quantum leap of faith at the level of holy men and women such as St. Clare, St. Francis, and the Lady Julian of Norwich. In one of her showings, God showed Julian something as small as a hazelnut. She was told by God this represented all of creation, and God said to Julian, "I made this, I loved it, and I will care for it." This is the trust we need now when it seems the world is collapsing around us. Mary said, "To me, the will of God is a dear book which I am never tired of reading and which has always some new charm for me." Nothing is too little to be noticed there. And again, God's presence is before me in almost everything. We are invited to read that book of a loving will by seeing where God has been in our own lives, by listening to the word of Scripture, and by looking at nature always true to its own being. A tree is always a tree till we interfere with it and turn it into paper, furniture, buildings, and so on. We are asked today to listen with love to the suffering other in every part of our world. The number dying each day is beyond our comprehension, but our trust is that God is present in our suffering, while at the same time calling from us a loving response. As Mary said, nothing we do is too small. Mary knew who she was even in moments of deepest hurt. It was this knowledge which leads us to our third element, love of self and of the other. Resilience, clarity of vision, respect for others, love of the other, love of duty were all aspects of Mary's self-love. They were qualities she had to call on from those early days at Portland until her death. When she was teaching in Portland, she wrote the following: God permitted a very bitter enemy to rise up against me, who said such things of me that all I cared for most turned against me, or if not quite against me, what was more painful still to me, I saw some of these fail in their duty through motives of fear and human respect. Here in Portland, Mary learnt to stand alone, as she had to do so many times in her life. She goes on to say, but peace, love and gratitude to our good God filled my heart the more these sorrows came to me. Mary reminds us today that our call is to love God as we love ourselves and to love our neighbour. We must love ourselves first. We cannot give to others what we do not possess. The source of Mary's ability to sustain this love, no matter what happened to her or her people, was God. Her deepest desire was to crawl into the Sacred Heart, a metaphor and symbol for deep love and compassion. And this symbol is warm and vital. As Mary says, when storms rage and when persecution or dangers threaten, I quietly creep into the abyss of God's heart, and securely sheltered there, my soul is at peace. The pulsing heart of a loving God, large enough to hold all times and all peoples, but at the same time open to each individual. A love we need to access deeply today. Finally, Mary honoured all of life and creation. She did not speak of ecology as we would know it today, but she knew the importance of place and home. Earth, as Pope Francis says, is our common home. In her Ascension Day letter, she speaks sadly of an unhappy home. My life as a child was one of sorrows, my home when I had it a most unhappy one. Mary struggled in Portland and other places to make a comfortable home for her family, a desire which was often thwarted by her father. A convent for her sisters so they could work safely and be cared for was always part of her agenda. St. Joseph's, North Sydney, was a place where she felt she belonged. It was here she gave retreats to the novices, and it was a place where she put down roots which would sustain her whenever she went, or wherever she went. It was here she was to die, and finally, many years later, to be reburied in the chapel of the Mother House. It was the Aboriginal people who sensed Mary's presence at St. Joseph's, North Sydney, long after her death, and who helped the sisters rename their mother house Mary MacKillop Place. It is her home, her place, and our home, our place, because she was first there. Because she had to travel to Rome to ensure the constitutions were approved, Mary saw more of our global home than many people of her time. New Zealand, Italy, Germany, France, England, Scotland, Ireland. Perhaps this gave her a sense of love for a world larger than Australia, the place she would always call home. Her sense of home and place can flow over into us today as we listen to Francis' call to honour our global home. Mary lived with what Brene Brown calls ordinary courage, not the heroic kind that our first responders have to call on in times of crisis. It's the kind of courage we need every day just to keep on a loving pathway. When the Quinn brothers mocked her and manipulated her, when Julian and herself had so many misunderstandings, when she was excommunicated, when she was exiled, when some of her sisters did not trust her, she had to call on her ordinary courage to live as a loving human being. This slipped into heroic courage when she forgave her abusers. Once, though, I am sorry to say, I felt anger, bitter and deep, or anguish rather, at some terrible things I heard, and the subject or object of it was a priest. And for the few minutes that the feeling lasted, I felt bitterly tempted against him. But thank goodness it did not last long, and I hope our dear Lord has forgiven me. Mary offers us a way of confronting our own anger and anguish, acknowledging it and letting it go, confident in God's love. Her final words spoken to her sister Annie have been mythologised, but they have meaning for us, particularly now. Go on, she said, and in love would say the same to us. Go on, you are needed where you are, especially now, at this time, in this place. Just go on, because there, where you are, you will find God.